Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. In this episode, I speak to Chris Marsh, a sociologist who's doing important work on alternative paths to becoming middle class for Black Americans. She identifies a group that goes against the assumption that marriage is the path to middle class living, and she's invented a new term, SALA, to describe this group, single and living alone. The conversation is fun and fascinating. We discuss how TV and film has shed light on this trend before academics discovered it, hence the name The Love Jones Cohort, which is a reference to the 1997 film Love Jones. In particular, she helps me clarify my thinking about how to consider singleism relative to the other isms, such as racism and sexism, something that we puzzled about in last week's episode, Not Lonely, Onely. Perhaps most importantly, she presents her brilliant response to the question, why aren't you married? That insight alone makes the episode worth listening to. As usual, please tell your solo friends and family about the podcast, the new message board on the solo page at petermcgraw.org, and that we have a new sponsor at rapturemask.com. Use promo code RaptureSolo to get your solo discount. I love this mask. Okay, I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Chris Marsh. Chris is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, a Fulbright scholar. Her research focuses on the Black middle class, demography, racial residential segregation, and education. She's a contributor to CNN in America, the Associated Press, NBC Washington, and Al Jazeera America, and she's frequently asked to contribute to the Washington Post. Chris is writing a book that examines the mental and physical health, wealth, residential choices, and dating practices of an emerging Black middle class that is single and living alone. Welcome, Chris.
Peter, it's so great to be with you today.
Oh my goodness. So we have been trying to set this up for months.
Yes, I had to come all the way to Los Angeles to talk to you, and I'm happy to be here.
I'm thrilled that you're here, and I appreciate you doing this. I have to tell you that I'm super impressed with what you've been doing with your work. I actually went down the rabbit hole, was reading some of your papers, and I want to talk to you about this work, especially about the Black middle class.
Sure, of course.
I think it's worth asking, how'd you get into doing this work? What's the origin story?
So, I don't want to make this the sociology of me, but I grew up in a predominantly white space. My parents did relatively well. And so once they got some money in the bank and money in their pocket, they wanted to move to the whitest neighborhood possible. They thought that was best for their 3 daughters,
okay.
3 Black daughters. So me and my sisters were the only Black children in school. Mm-hmm. And so I got to a point where I was like, okay, I want to kind of understand what the Black middle class experience really is.
Okay.
In some ways, I think Black middle class adolescents have a sense of an identity crisis. They don't fit in with the Black poor because they have different lived experiences, but they also don't fit in with the white middle class because of the racial differences, right? Yes. And so I've always wanted to study that. And so I got to graduate school and I wanted to study kind of like this identity crisis, but I thought it was first important to understand where the Black middle class lived. So I'm looking at some of the demographic literature and I'm like, okay, so there's like this whole kind of concept of where the Black middle class lives, but I'm looking at the demographic literature and seeing that there's a shift away from marriage. People aren't married as much as they used to. So the segregation literature is really talking about where married couples with children live, but there's not a conversation about where people who are Black middle class and single, where they're living. So I kind of started there and it took off from that point.
That's super interesting because first of all, it sounds like we lived opposite childhood lives because I grew up in a town that started out as, I'd say, white middle class, white lower middle class. Mm-hmm. And then all these Black families were moving in.
Right.
The white families left, white flight.
Right.
And so I was I graduated from a high school that was 75% plus black.
Oh, wow.
And so I had a different experience that was there.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned white flight, because I teach this class on segregation, and students always think because blacks move into a neighborhood, it drops the property value. It's not the presence of blacks moving in. It's that so many whites are moving out. So white flight is driven by white behavior, not by black presence.
Yes.
And I always love to clarify that whenever I'm talking to somebody.
Yeah, I think, and, you know, for me personally, it ended up being like a really wonderful experience. And, you know, in terms of to have such diversity as a young man, you know, obviously in a country that struggles with its diversity.
Yes. But being one of only, I was like, every day I was questioned about, why is your hair like that? Why is your butt like that? Why do you talk like that? So you become the token, and then you have to represent all of Black America. So it was challenging.
Yeah, no one was asking me about my hair or my butt. I will tell you that.
Good thing for you. I got it on a daily basis.
Yeah, I get it. It would be hard to have to represent.
Right.
Yes, that's that. Yeah, I wouldn't say our situations were parallel in any way, but I think that there's sort of a fascinating reversal there. You know, as you talk about this, we were just chatting a little bit about my book that came out. I talk about Chris Rock and how he was able to sort of expand his perspective, because he kind of never fit in his black neighborhood in Brooklyn. And then he got bused to a white school and he didn't fit in there again. So he didn't fit in the neighborhood because of his perspective and his nerdiness, and he didn't fit in his school because of his blackness.
Right. There's a research project there to be done. I'm like trying to convince my graduate students or someone to do it. But I do believe that Black middle class adolescents, they do kind of have to straddle two worlds. And how does that look? And what does that look like? And the question becomes like, what's authentically Black then, right?
Yes.
So it's like, if you didn't grow up poor, if you didn't grow up without having with your lights being cut off and having to have sugar sandwiches for dinner, is that the only Black experience? No, there's other Black experiences where you go to Aspen for winter break and go skiing.
Yes.
But we just have to make sure we understand that Black America is not a monolithic. And just because you go skiing in Aspen doesn't mean that you're any less Black. And just because you have your lights cut off means that you're more Black.
Indeed. You know, I came across this, I think it was a Twitter post about a Black medical worker. I don't know if he was a doctor or a nurse, but he got pulled over and he was in his scrubs, and he got treated completely differently than he had in the past. And you know what his solution was? He started wearing his scrubs all the time.
Right.
Because it just allowed him to move in this world in a completely different way, because he was able to belong to a different category than he would have otherwise.
That is so funny, because I had a similar conversation with a friend of mine, and he's a kidney surgeon.
Okay.
And so his mom was telling him, be sure to always wear like your badge and your white coat home. It'll bring you home safely.
Oh my
and
God.
he was like, but I've been pulled over before. And then when I do have on my white coat and my badge that says I'm a surgeon, the officers think like, oh, you think you're better than me. So either way, it could be a lose-lose situation. Like, oh, so you're all hoity-toity because you're a surgeon. Well, let me show you who has power, because it is a power dynamic. And in that case, the officer has all the power.
Yes, that's funny. Well, that was pre-COVID, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, I think these examples are illustrative of the challenges of this group. So, what I'm impressed by your work is I teach my graduate students about what makes a good paper. And I talk about positioning an academic paper as you are creating a unique solution to an important problem. And so when you unpack that idea, okay, unique. So it's like you're saying something that no one else is saying.
Right.
Right. You're solving a problem. So you have to actually present a problem in the paper. And the beautiful thing about academia is you get to pick the problem,
right,
and you get to pick the solution, at least mostly,
right,
unless someone hijacks it in the peer review process. And as I was reading your paper, and this is incredibly difficult, so I don't know about your field, but what is acceptance rates in journals are 1%, 5%,
right,
10%, right? That kind of thing. And the more elite the journal, the more difficult the process,
right,
typically. So, I think what you have done with your work is you've found an important problem and you have a unique solution. And so I'm going to try to say it, and then you tell me if I have an understanding.
Okay.
Is that
deal.
okay? All right, good.
Yes.
I'm sure you'll tell me if I get it wrong. You can give me a grade. So before your work, the sociological literature focus on the black middle class looked at married couples, families with children.
Yes.
Okay. And that makes an assumption, that work implicitly or explicitly makes an assumption that having a dual income and being married is being middle class.
Right.
And then it also assumes that marriage leads to becoming middle class. But as you point out, if two poor people get married, that doesn't make them middle class.
That does not make them middle class.
And so you suggested a lot of things, but one of them is, well, maybe middle class may lead you to getting married. Like the causal arrow may head in the other direction. And then you have dove very deeply into a different path to the middle class.
Right.
And what is that?
Right.
Now, so wait, how did I do?
You did great.
Okay, good.
Well, I think also you have to understand it's with research, we've kind of got our research question, we've got our problem we're trying to solve. But I believe there's beauty in the interpretation. So you may interpret it very differently than I interpret it. So it's great that we may not see it exactly the same. And that's the beautiful part about the research process.
Okay, so what have I gotten wrong then?
So you haven't got anything wrong per se with air quotes. It's just that what happened to a lot of the scholars that were talking about the black middle class, it wasn't so forward where they were saying that you have to be married with children. It was kind of like a subtle assumption.
I see.
And so I picked up on that subtle assumption and I ran with it.
Okay.
Some of the earlier work said to be middle class, you have to have both mother and father working outside of the household. So that assumes if you have to have both mother and father working outside the household, you have to be married. And so from there, I kind of started to really open up that conversation and say, hey, wait a minute. But if we look at the demographic literature, we know marriage rates are changing for all racial and ethnic groups, and lower marriage rates are way more pronounced for blacks. So are you also suggesting that the black middle class is going to shrink because marriage rates are shrinking? And I'm like, no, I think that there's just a compositional shift in the black middle class away from married couples to young black professionals who aren't married and don't have any children. The social scientists couldn't quite see that, but media seemed to have got that under control. So I was trying to merge those two into conversation with each other.
Yes. Okay. So so black women are 2 times more likely than white women to not marry by 45.
Right.
And they're also twice as likely, if they do marry, to get divorced.
Right.
So there are a lot more single women in this community.
Yeah. So now the really interesting question about that is like, okay, so are black women and white women, or singles in period, but we can talk about black and white women because that's who you mentioned. Are they choosing to be single by choice or by force?
Yes.
Which we're sitting in the middle of 2 global pandemics right now.
Yes.
And now people are starting to use the words like white supremacy, structural racism. So how does structural racism play into the choices that black women have to marry men if they want to marry men of same kind of socioeconomic statuses?
Okay.
So it becomes a really interesting conversation that we can have right now because we're sitting in this kind of context where we can acknowledge that structural racism does exist.
Yes, let's do that then.
Great.
So, and then I want to get to the media stuff, and I want to get to some of these other things. So obviously marriage rates are going down for a variety of reasons. So let's talk through the reasons in general, and then the reasons specifically for blacks in America.
Okay. So if we look at it from like a demographic perspective, there's like a sex ratio imbalance. There are like just more professional black women than there are professional black men. But now there's a couple of assumptions we have to make there. We're assuming that it's going to be a heterosexual relationship.
Yes.
We're also assuming that it's going to be a same race relationship.
Yes. Okay.
Right? Because we're not talking about interracial relationships. We're talking about same sex, same race. So if black women want to marry black men, there's just not enough numbers out there for every black woman to marry a black man. So that's going to
both in terms of actual numbers, that there are more black women than black men, but then also this idea of socioeconomic status, that there tends to be some matching that happens.
Right. So it's the educational homogamy literature. So if I have a PhD, I probably want to marry somebody who has a PhD,
Yes,
right?
right.
So if a black woman has a PhD, there aren't eligible black men that have PhDs that she can marry. So what does she do? Does she marry down? Does she marry outside of her race?
Or does she not marry?
Or does she not marry,
Yes,
right? We also know in the literature that, like, we think about interracial dating, black women are willing to interracially date, but you don't have other races that want to date them.
Yes, I found a thing about, like, what's really amazing is these dating apps,
right,
collect tons of data.
Exactly.
It's not self-report; it's real behavior, right? Swipes and so on,
right?
And it's like black women and Asian men
are the least likely to get likes and winks and all of that on the dating
all
websites.
of that stuff.
Yeah,
and what's amazing is the people who they're like, I'm not racist. I just like what I like.
Right. I just have a preference, but I have black friends.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
But my mentor, who's an economist, he always said, if we want to really solve this problem, Asian men and black women should get married if they want to get married.
That's hilarious.
Like, right? Because, like you said, they're the least likely to be approached in the dating websites.
Yes.
So I was saying,
hold on. We should launch.
Okay,
a dating app.
Okay, you heard it here first. No one can take the idea because we're getting ready to take it and run with it. So here's the thing. So black women have to decide if they want to marry up, they want to marry down, they want to interracially date, or do they want to remain single?
Yes.
But the question is about this singlehood is like, how are people perceiving this singlehood?
Yes. Well, that's why I have a podcast called Solo, the Single Person's Guide to a Remarkable Life.
Right.
Because
right.
if people were thinking that naturally, I wouldn't need to have a podcast.
Right. So it's like you have the PhD, you're making $250,000, you've got property all across the country, but when you meet somebody, they're like, well, why aren't you married? Mm-hmm. So it's discounted everything else that you've done. It normalizes marriage. And so I'm hoping that my work can say, hey, listen, you can be single, you can live alone, you can live a very fulfilled life, and you can still be very middle class. Mm-hmm. But people are still kind of stuck in this kind of like heteronormative understanding of how people should be. Husband, wife, 2.5 kids, and a black picket fence. I'm like, no, I've got to push back against this because the demographic literature is telling me that there's a subset of black America who are just not going to get married.
Yes.
If they want to marry somebody on their same level, they're just not going to get married. And we have to kind of push the conversation, especially right now in COVID. I've talked to a lot of people and they're saying like, it's so much better to be alone than to wish that I was alone. Mm-hmm. Why are people actually getting married? I want to have that kind of conversation. You're getting married for what purpose? Mm-hmm. Because it's a social pressure, or it's because it's what you want to do?
Yes. I actually, I've been sort of working through a lot of ideas. I've been doing a lot of writing. I think that, there's a lot of, and I want to talk to you about singleism as an ism.
Yeah.
But, and we can point to the problems that it causes. My feeling about the problems that it causes, aside from, there's housing stuff, there's money stuff, there's employment stuff, and so on. I think that the worst part of the stigma against single people is that it inhibits them from living their best life.
Right.
That is, that they don't walk the path that is best for them. They walk the path that the world says they should be walking.
Right.
And I think that's an incredibly lost opportunity.
Right.
Okay. So, and how does this within the black community fit into a greater demographic shift that we're seeing in America, across the world, of more singles and more singles living alone?
Right. Because I think once we have the race conversation, that's when we really have to tease out whether or not it's by choice or it's by force. I would argue that Black America, in some ways, it's by force. They don't have comparable mates to marry.
Okay.
But for white America, we're going to keep it simple and just keep it black and white.
Sure. Okay.
For white America, like, we want to choose a different path right now. We don't want to get married right now. There are probably people that they could marry, comparable mates, but they're choosing not to. So it's more of a choice. In Black America, you have so many like professional Black women in particular where they just can't find comparable mates. So they're carving out this own kind of innovative way into middle class and singlehood for themselves.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I want to ask though, I think that there are some inklings of this in white America too, where you're starting to see the rise of women, greater opportunities in terms of education and so on, and a decline in men. Young men especially really struggling. Yeah. You're seeing this at the university levels, and so on. But you think that those changes are more about choice than about the lack of opportunity.
I think it's more about choice.
Okay.
Now, if we are starting to see that demographic shift in white America, white women should pay homage to black women because they've taught them what to do. We've been doing it for years, so we don't taught y'all what to do. So give us praise and call us the pioneers.
Indeed, I completely agree with that. It bothers me to see, and I think this is a fascinating literature. I read a lot. I've started reading a lot of books about single living. There's not that many of them.
Right.
But the lion's share of the ones that exist are ones of like, yeah, I know that being single sucks and you really want to be married. Here's how you cope with it. And here's how you get a man. Right. Because they're almost all written for women.
Right. Right.
And there are these sort of messages is like, he's good enough.
Right.
If I find the book, I'll put it in the exhibits. But there's like a book basically is like, just do it. Right. Just get it done. You're not going to find. And I'm just like, I'm not sure that's the right way to be thinking about this.
Fast forward that to 15 years, and what does that look like? Fast forward that to COVID, and what does that look like? If he's good enough and you're working a 9 to 5 and you only have to deal with him or tolerate him for a couple hours, now we're in COVID and you're in the house with this person for 24 hours out of the day. It's so funny because a lot of my friends are saying like, oh, we're going to see like a uptick in fertility after COVID. I was like, absolutely not. You're going to see uptick in divorce because people realize I don't like the person that I'm in a relationship with. And see, what I tell everybody is like, you have to be happy and healthy and whole as your own person first before you get into a relationship. A relationship is not going to do that for you.
Yes.
And so you can live your best life. You should be living your best life by yourself. And then if you decide to add somebody to that story, then so be it. But you cannot let a relationship be the story that leads you into like this wonderful life.
Chris, you are like the poster child for this podcast. Thank you so much. I completely agree. I've actually had a divorce mediator / lawyer on to talk about these issues. Mm-hmm. I've had a couple friends who their partner has dropped the D-bomb on them during the pandemic.
Right.
And you're just like, okay.
Right. Which is unfortunate. But again, you have to kind of question, why exactly did you get married in the first place?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right.
Is it just to check that box? Yeah.
I think that's right.
And I hope the research kind of pushes back against that narrative.
I do too. I look, and I think that this is I think we have to give people an alternative narrative. Mm-hmm. Because if you go looking for the narrative, what you end up finding are people who are kind of like a little sad and whiny and resigned to their imperfect single life.
Right.
Or how can I problem solve my way out of this?
Right. Oh, but you know what? I want to get back to a point that you made earlier. I think the onus is kind of on us as scholars because, we can write stuff about, look at the sucky single life. Right. And there's stuff that's been out there about the sucky single life. But if we're really starting to kind of push that conversation in a different direction and talk about the positiveness of the single life and what are some of the advantages of it and what are some of the innovative things that you can do, we now start to give people a hope and understanding and a narrative to wrap their minds around. But there's not a lot of work that's done out there because it's a value judgment. Everything is value judgment placed on married with children.
Well, Chris, we are doing it right here.
Yes, right here, right now.
And so what I like about your work is it suggests an alternative path.
Right.
And one that I think is actually really reasonable and rational, mm-hmm. and one that you don't have to be resigned.
Right.
Because I think that there are great opportunities walking that different path. I don't know how much so when I say like I grew up with a single mom, mm-hmm. a fairly absent father, and I say we were food stamps poor, we weren't welfare poor.
Okay.
Right. So to put it in perspective, kind of thing. And I wonder how much, and I had to like really work hard to survive mm-hmm. until I got to a certain age where I could sort of switch from survive to thrive, mm-hmm. And I wonder how much that has also contributed to my solo living, mm-hmm. where like, okay, I'm lean, I'm agile, it's just me. I can make my way on my own. I can eat ramen. I can make this work. And then while a lot of people think about, well, if you partner up, you make a team, you're better off. You're just like, well, that's a pretty risky team to put all your eggs in that one basket.
Absolutely.
And a divorce can wipe out everything that you have and so on. And I don't know how much it has influenced me in terms of sort of playing it safe as a single in my life. I think there are other much more predictive reasons for why I've ended up solo. But nonetheless, when you think about it, it's actually, I don't think that's an unreasonable way for someone to think, which is, I've worked so hard to get where I am. You know, do I want a 1/3 probability that I'm worse off?
Right.
I don't know.
Right. But you bring up some really good points.
Okay.
And one of the things that people have said, we know in the literature, they talk about singles being like selfish and narcissistic and they don't want to like partner up. I was like, but we also know that we like extend ourselves to our extended family, our time to our extended family. We give more than married folks.
Yes.
And so it's like, you can't say that we're narcissistic and selfish.
Oh, this is the most infuriating stereotype of single people.
Right.
For the reasons that you say. So the data, I mean, I was surprised by the data, to be honest, because I've been inculcated in this world. So, right, so I actually did a podcast with a comedian, Leanne Lord, who she has a podcast called People with Parents that's focused on caregiving your parents.
Yes.
And the literature is very clear. This solos pick up the lion's share, disproportionate amount of caregiving to parents.
Right.
They donate more. They volunteer more.
Yep.
They are more connected to friends and their community.
Yep.
And so the idea that they're selfish is crazy.
Right.
Plus, is there anything more than selfish than like creating miniature versions of yourself? Like, I mean, my thing is this, it's not that married people are selfish or single people are selfish, is that people act in their self-interest generally.
Right.
And self-interest, though, is this broad concept.
Right.
Where being a good friend is a self-interested act.
Right.
You know, and giving to your community is a self-interested act because you're part of the community.
Right.
So I think it's completely spurious to say that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I wanted to have you on here because I like this idea of an alternative path to thriving. You know, you have identified a group of people who are thriving in this unconventional way.
Yes.
And so the name of your book, I want to call it forthcoming. You say writing, but
potato, hopefully.
Yes, is called The Love Jones Cohort: Single and Living Alone in the Black Middle Class.
Yes.
Okay. So for people who don't understand the reference to the Love Jones Cohort, where did that come from?
Okay. So there was so if you look like in media, small screen, big screen, you see like 2-parent households with like the quintessential 2-parent household.
The Cosby Show.
Exactly. That was the perfect example. You have a lawyer
and a doctor,
and 4 children.
Yes.
Right. And so we can't even really say Cosby now. But anyway, okay. So
well, it shows you what a farce that is.
Right. So then you started to see where media was starting to move away from these 2-parent households to these young Black professionals who weren't married, don't have any children, and were kind of just thinking about their careers and lives and navigating the world.
Can I ask a clarifying question
Yes.
here? You're talking sort of 80s, 90s? Because, you know, I remember sort of Black TV. I remember Sanford and Son and the Jeffersons.
Right.
As some of the early kind of
and like Good Times. So,
Good Times,
right?
yes.
So you had a lot of shows where there was like Black poverty and Black struggle,
right.
And then we started to get kind of like these middle class households.
Okay.
We got the Cosbys, who by definition I guess would be considered upper
middle
class.
class, yeah.
You know, in my
Upper
research,
class.
either you're middle class or you're not. Either you made it or you didn't. I don't parse out lower middle class, middle class, and upper middle class.
I think that's actually a fair thing to do, given the research on the value of income, is that it's a nonlinear effect. Once you get past some threshold, it's nice, but it's not crucial.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the sociologists, they definitely parse out, and we have to have this kind of constant conversation back and forth. So you saw like Black poverty, Black struggle. Then you started to see a pivot, and you started to see like middle class or elite Black families. But again, it was always Black families, a husband, a wife. Then The Love Jones Cohort, I think it was the late 90s. The Love Jones. It was a movie.
Okay.
And it was like black
1997.
1997.
I looked it up.
Okay,
yes.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you start to see like this new kind of character emerge where marriage isn't necessarily as salient as it was in some of these other movies. So what I tried to do with the book is I try to use a classic demographic term because I am a demographer, and I try to use a media reference. So that's how I came up with the Love Jones Cohort.
Okay, so what is the premise of Love Jones? That's the movie, Love Jones.
Yes.
What's the premise of the movie?
So it's young black professionals trying to navigate life.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
kind of what they're trying to do.
Yes, I see. Okay. And is it a romantic film? Like, is it
I think
like,
it is a rom-com by definition, which I don't watch any of those.
Got it.
At all, ever, because that's not reality, and I just don't watch rom-coms. My sister loves them, but I will never watch them.
Yeah, they're pretty brutal. I get it. I wanted to know because I have yet to watch it. I'm going to watch it.
Oh, great.
But I remember watching I think about 90s. There's a movie called Singles from the early 90s, but it's set in Seattle. So it's sort of a 90210 style, a bunch of people, a group of friends, and dating, and it's built around the kind of grunge kind of thing.
I haven't seen that, so that's on my list now.
Yeah, I forget. One of the Dylan brothers is in it. There's Bridget Fonda's in it. There's a bunch of things, but it's a great soundtrack. That's why I rediscovered the soundtrack on Spotify recently. Any case. So basically the media was picking this up. There's also another film called The Brothers that you talk about.
Yes.
2001.
Yeah.
About a group of black brothers and their trials and tribulations, navigating
life. I think we grew up
life.
in Inglewood, California,
Okay.
I forgot now.
So I wanted to ask you, we'll get back to this because I think this idea of media stuff is interesting because I actually think that the media is going to help drive this narrative.
Absolutely. Well, because you're starting to see the shift now because you also had like Living Single.
That's what I was going to ask about.
So that was for black women, which is funny because Friends came out after Living Single.
Yes.
Yeah. On a side note, and because I just absolutely love Aretha Franklin, which has absolutely nothing to do with singlehood, but you said we're just going to have a casual conversation. So, of course, I got to find a way to drop Aretha Franklin in there. Aretha Franklin actually released a version of Let It Be before the Beatles, I believe. It's a fascinating version.
I'm going to find it on YouTube and put it in the exhibit.
And please cite me if I'm right that it's before the Beatles released theirs, and if I'm wrong, because it's either right before or right after the Beatles. But she does a wonderful version, and it just drips with soul.
I bet.
Well, I like the Beatles version of Let It Be too, but Aretha Franklin's is so incredibly amazing. And I do believe that she released hers before the Beatles.
Well, so this Living Single thing has come up because they're talking about rebooting it. I don't know if you heard this.
Yeah.
Yes. So Living Single is basically. Yeah, it preceded Friends. And it was well reviewed and I think. But then I actually did some research on this. These stupid networks put Friends and Living Single up against each other.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to say stupid network because they're competing, but I'm just like, why could you not, like, knowing that it might actually appeal not racially, but psychographically, right? Not demographically, but rather psychographically. That is that there are a group of people who are focused on their single life.
Right.
Why not give them more offerings rather than make them choose?
Right. And, one of the things I grappled with while I was writing the book is whether or not I wanted to talk about people that are single and living alone as solo, because you have that book by Eric Kleinenberg.
Yeah, Going Solo, yeah.
Yeah. And so but when I wrote my piece, I called them solas, single and living alone.
Yes.
And so I did not want to change it to solo because I thought solo didn't take into account race. And I decided to call them solas because solas do take into account race. And as I said before, I feel like in a lot of ways, Black America has taught singles how to be single. And so I wanted to make sure and make that distinction. I don't want to parse out and make too many distinctions within the group, but I do understand that there is the unique distinction that needs to be made along racial lines and who's been doing this for the longest time. And it's important that we have that conversation. Similar to Living Single.
Yes.
We had 4 black women who were kind of like tracking their lives. I was like, but then Friends comes along and they can't compete. But I was like, the reality is Living Single came first. They were first.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about this because obviously I chose solo as the topic as the name of this podcast. I looked hard. I thought hard. I continue to think hard about the right language to use. I think naming things matters.
Yes.
I think if you name something well, you can win the game.
Yes.
And I think that's in academia. I think that's in life in general. And so this idea of SALA, single and living alone, which is part of your subtitle, was inspired in part by other acronyms.
Yes.
What were those acronyms?
So solo was one of them.
Okay.
And then we had like DINKS. It was like dual income.
No kids. Yes.
Yes. And Dukes.
I had never heard this one before.
Well, so that was one of the criticisms I got when I first wrote that piece in Social Forces. They were like, well, why aren't you using some of these acronyms? And why? I was like, because I'm carving out a whole new demographic group and I've made my own acronym.
Yes.
Is there a problem?
So Dukes are dual earners with kids.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I want to ask about this. So you see SALA as the Black version of solo? Or you see SALA as so help me understand that.
So I don't necessarily see SALA as a Black version. You can be SALA, white or Black.
Got it.
But I didn't want to use the word solo because I think when you think of solo, we're not having a unique race conversation.
I see. Okay.
So I think SALAs allows us to have a race conversation. So a Black person can be a SALA, a white person can be a SALA, a purple person can be a SALA.
Okay.
But the Love Jones cohort, that is specifically for Black middle class people that are SALAs.
I see. Okay, that's good. So let's talk then about this. Oh, wait. Before we do this, so basically what I'm doing right now, this is for the listeners not paying close attention, is I'm deconstructing Chris's title of her book, which is The Love Jones Cohort. We just covered that. Single and Living Alone. That's the SALA. We just talked about that.
Yeah.
And then you say, in the Black middle class.
Yes.
So one of the things that you have done is you've been very, because you're an academic, because you're a nerd,
Right.
and because to navigate,
And fully embrace it.
yes, and to navigate the peer review process, you have to be incredibly clear about what this is, because
And methodical.
this scholar defines the Black middle class as X, that scholar as Y, and if you have two different definitions, you can't have a conversation about this.
Right.
So you have 4 criteria.
Yes.
All must be met.
Yes.
In order to qualify.
Yes.
And this is Black middle class, or is this middle class?
So this is Black middle class.
Black middle class. Okay.
So it's a
I
measure
wrote them
relative.
down.
Okay,
but I can also quiz you on them.
Okay.
So what are some of those for?
So we have education, income, occupation, and wealth, which we use homeownership as a proxy for wealth.
Okay.
So what I did
Correct.
Yeah, I passed my test. So what I did was I looked at census data from 1980 until 2010, and I've looked up to 2014 as well. And I looked at all Black households.
Okay.
And then I looked at the median income for all Black households.
Okay.
If you were above the median for all Black households, you received a score of 1 on the Black middle class index that I developed.
Okay.
If anybody in the household had a college degree, you received a 1 on the index I developed. If your occupational score was above the median for all Black middle class households, you received a 1 on occupation.
Okay.
And then if you owned a home, were buying or owning or owned a home, you received a 1 on the index.
Okay.
So let me be really clear. If you have somebody who has a PhD, they make $250,000, they're professional, but they do not own a home or any other assets, they will not show up in my data set as middle class.
Okay, that seems weird to me.
I know. I get so much pushback. I was at a conference one day and this lady came up to me. I mean, she was irate. She was like, I wrote 5 books and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, I'm a demographer. I'm trying to show that this demographic group exists and it's growing and what the trends are. I'm looking across time. I was like, I had to have some very strict measures. I do think that if I would have relaxed my standards some on the wealth measure, I mean, it would have been a much bigger group.
Yes.
But part of the research talks about the fragility of the Black middle class, and they're 1 or 2 paychecks away from poverty because they don't have any assets.
Yes.
So I wanted to argue this is like a solid group within the Black middle class. So I had to do homeownership. I'm not putting a value judgment on homeownership. Understand that. I'm clearly saying that they have assets. So when COVID hits, they could draw their assets to move forward if they need to.
Chris, I could tell by what you're saying.
You've
been beat up
about this. Absolutely.
You have been beat up about it. You had me at, it's a more conservative test of Black middle class.
Yeah.
So I get it. But to me, let's just dive into this, not as a critique, because I actually,
Right.
I buy your rationale, which is like, I need to measure something and I can't tell how much money they have in their brokerage account.
Right.
And buying a home or, a condo or something correlates with
Right.
this because it's America.
Right.
Because we've been taught, brainwashed, that you need to get married and have the white picket fence. I think, of course, the challenge is that solos are more mobile and they have more options.
Right.
And, they don't have to have the security of a home because they don't have children oftentimes. And so I had I had my financial planner, Money Amy, on, and we were talking about financial freedom for single people. And what's interesting is the sort of check boxes in the path is almost exactly the same. But when the house thing comes up, her argument was, don't buy a place unless you know you're going to be in it for 5 years. And if you're super mobile,
Right.
as solos can be, more so, it's hard to be like, I'm going to be here for 5 years.
Right. It's
And
like,
so,
what?
yeah, exactly.
5
And so,
years. Come on now. Who knows?
yes, that's right.
But two points to that. One is that people are often say like, who do you want to read your book? Who's your audience? I was like, everybody.
Yes. Right.
But I also think wealth management companies should really read the book because I don't think they do a good job of really catering to the single market. And there's beautiful commercials out there where you have same-sex relationships, you see interracial relationships, but I don't see that single person represented in the commercials.
Yes.
And I'm like, okay, yeah, you know what? You got to buy the book because you're missing out on the whole entire market. Not to exploit, but there's a market there.
To serve. Yes.
Right. And so I think with singles also, they have a very diverse financial portfolio, because they're like, okay, maybe I don't want to be tied down to a house, but
Yes.
I can get into stocks, bonds, precious metals. They can do different kind of things. So we need to have that conversation with wealth management companies. Like, really, Charles Schwab, where you at?
Yes. And singles can lever up risk. Because they have a lower burn rate. They don't have to worry about paying college tuition in 10 years.
Right.
And so they can have longer timelines in terms of investing.
Yeah. If I want to eat popcorn for dinner because I'm in a bad investment, I can eat popcorn for dinner until it turns around.
Yes. So actually, I have a book sitting right here that says Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Agers.
Right.
And so this is just a preview for the listeners, just to keep you folks listening. I'm going to do a follow-up to solo caregiving about solo aging. How do you prepare to age as a single person?
Right.
Which, by the way, married people should be listening to too, because there's a good chance that you're going to end up as a solo ager, even though you're married, 50-50,
Like,
higher
right.
if you're a woman.
Right. But that's kind of like, that's the whole premise of like Elia Kim's book, Happy Singlehood.
Yes, that's
it's like,
right.
as you age, if you're single, you already kind of like have that network in place. So you kind of get it. But older people are returning back to singlehood. So they don't know how to navigate like aging.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing a series about selling to singles. And because singles have different needs and desires and lifestyle and values, they have other opportunities. And so the wealth management stuff is in there, which is, I completely agree with you as a result of that.
Yeah, the commercials have come a long way, but they have a long way to go.
Yeah, and I think some of it is just like, I don't want to dive too deeply in this because we're going to digress a little bit, but I've always talked to my students, especially my finance-focused students in my marketing class, about why don't you have more demographically and psychographically relevant investment vehicles? So why wouldn't you have a special type of mutual fund for people like you and me who are tenured professors and have job security?
Absolutely.
Right? So,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
so I agree with you. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think a lot of these corporations, because they're run by married people,
They don't think
they're
that.
asleep at the wheel.
Right.
And they're not paying attention to enough of the demographic stuff
Right.
that's there. And then they're not paying attention to the psychographic stuff, which you alluded to at the outset of this, which is, are you single by choice or by force?
Right.
I think that when you split along that line, suddenly there's very different needs
Right.
that are there.
Yes.
And as I think you're alluding to, is the best thing you can do if it's by force is to turn it into choice.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So, all right. So you have these So you have these criteria. Got check. And what does your research show?
So my research shows that married couples in the Black middle class are decreasing, and single and living alone are actually increasing. In 2000, the second largest household in the Black middle class were single and living alone, were solace. The second largest household in the Black middle class were solace, behind married couples, but they were less than 50%. So the second largest household in the Black middle class were single and living alone adults. So the question becomes, how is the Black middle class going to reproduce itself? Because class status is usually transferred from parent to child.
And that's how, and that's the dirty little secret of America,
right?
Which is most wealth gets created because someone dies. And
intergenerational transfer of wealth. Absolutely.
That's right.
So if Salas are the second largest household type in the Black middle class and they don't have a partner and they don't have children, who are they going to transfer their wealth to? One, you need to make sure that all Salas have trust and living trust and wills.
Okay.
And two, who are they going to transfer their wealth to? It becomes a very innovative question for Salas to think about, am I going to leave it to my sorority, my fraternity, to my college, to my church? It becomes a really interesting conversation.
Am I going to try to spend it all in those last 10 years?
I'm done with it, right? Am I going to leave it to nieces, nephews, godchildren?
Yes.
I was like, but those aren't the kind of conversations that wealth managers are having with singles, and they should.
Yes. I'm so happy you're saying this because I have on my to-do list, all it says is will.
Yeah.
And I've decided, in the vein of living a remarkable life, that I'm going to create a very fun will.
Okay.
And I'm going to create a trust.
Yeah.
My niece and nephew don't listen to this, so I think it's safe to say. But I'm going to, but one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to set an age in which they get their money, if there's any left.
Right.
Right. Kind of things. That's right. If I live to 100 and spend it all,
like,
sorry, kids, you got nothing.
Right.
But that number, their age is going to be way higher than they want it to be.
Right.
Because, being poor sucks.
Right.
But being old and poor is horrible.
Right.
And so I need to avoid the worst case scenario for my niece and nephew,
right,
which is that they're old and poor.
Right.
And so so they're going to be unhappy with the trust, but they won't be old and poor. But I'm going to do a lot of fun things where I'm going to gift to people I know fun gifts and so on. These are people who have supported me through my life.
Right.
And so they might as well get to have some fun,
right,
as a result of my demise.
Right. And see, it depends on how you want to approach it. You can approach it from a very optimistic or pessimistic perspective to say, hey, listen, I'm putting a living trust together. I don't have a partner. I don't have children. I'm going to do some fun and innovative things with my money, or like, oh gosh, woe is me. I don't have a partner. Who am I going to give all my stuff to?
Yes.
And so as academics, I'm like, I would love to have like some scholarships in place for young Black girls coming behind me that want to be demographers. I'm like, there's no reason why I can't. I don't have any nieces or nephews. I have some godchildren and they'll get some, but they're going to be okay. Like you said, poverty sucks. And so it would be really, really great to have some scholarships in place.
I think that's great.
And singles have the ability to kind of have people think differently about bequeathing assets to the next generation. It doesn't have to be to your nuclear family, as some would call it.
Yes.
Your traditional, air quotes, family. You can extend that conversation. My students in some ways are my family. So I'm going to make sure that I leave something for them.
Yes, that's right.
Or like the Urban Tribe as what is it, Waters? He wrote a book called Urban Tribe.
Oh, I'm not familiar.
Oh, what's his first name? His last name is Waters. Please don't ask me his first name.
I'll put it in the exhibits. I'll find it.
Okay, yeah. And so he talks about how people kind of like, I think the book takes place in New York, and talks about how like young people are like building these urban tribes to kind of navigate singlehood.
Oh,
yeah.
I have to read that.
Oh
okay.
gosh, I have to find the reference now.
That's going to be an interesting. I mean, what really is happening? I'm really so excited about this project, and I'm so thrilled we finally got a chance to meet.
I know, right?
Because like my mind right now is just swirling with all these possibilities. Because so in the same way that you had this breakthrough idea, which is marriage and middle class are not the equivalent,
right? And
then once you break that bond, you break that connection, it opens up a new perspective, and now you can produce scholarship, which then perhaps changes other people's perspective and then guides young scholars in terms of exploring this. It has real implications for real people's lives. That is, that they can decide on a different path and and thus live more comfortably, live more optimistically, live with a greater sense of opportunity, with real greater opportunities.
Right.
And then once you start removing yourself from this, it's difficult in some way because you have more choices, but it's better in some ways because you have more choices, right? So you don't just default to, well, I guess my kids are going to get my wealth. I worked so hard to build this, they just get it.
Right. Or my nieces and nephews.
Or my nieces and nephews is automatically the case, right? Sorry, kids. But but you're right. And that's why I'm doing the Selling to Singles series, because these companies, these entrepreneurs are drinking the Kool-Aid. Right. They haven't seen Love Jones.
Right.
They haven't seen the brothers. They haven't read your
book.
articles.
How dare them?
And so once you pull that back, there's all this opportunity to create products and services.
Right.
So, can I ask you a digressed question?
We've been doing that all day. Of course you can.
So one of the episodes is best inventions, best innovations for singles. I'm curious, off the top of your head, can't say birth control. What is, in your opinion, the best invention or the best innovation for single people?
Being defined as a family of one.
Tell me more.
Being defined as a family of one. So I look at census data. So people that are single and living alone, never been married, no children, they would not show up as a family. They would show up as a household. And there are advantages to being a family. You get a discount on like your medical benefits if you're a family.
Okay.
But because by census definition, you have to be related by marriage, blood, or adoption to be a family.
Okay.
If you're a family of one, if you're single, you cannot be a family. And I think that there are advantages to being a family. Your insurance rates are going to be better. Your medical insurance rates are going to be better if you're a family. Your tax rate's going to be better if you're a family.
But has that happened?
No.
Oh, that would be the best innovation.
That would be the best. Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I thought we're like, okay, if we had all the money in the world, what would we invent? I would change the way in which we define family. If one person can be a family of one. I am related to myself. I am a family of one.
So I love this idea because occasionally I'll do an episode where it's just me. I call it solo thoughts talking, because I just don't want to victimize the guest with me, going on and on about something. I responded in this episode to an Arthur Brooks article in The Atlantic. And in it, he talks about success addicts and all this kind of thing. But what was interesting is just implicitly through the whole article, you realize he's talking to parents, basically, and mostly male parents in it. And the Atlantic has a very strong family bias. They have a section called The Family. And in it, they describe the family as the most basic unit in America.
Right.
And I remember reading that and going, how is that the most basic unit?
Right.
Especially because most people are not, in any case, have a family necessarily. They may be part of one, but they're not like part of it. So this idea of, defining a family as the singleton, as the single unit, I see what you're saying is it then eliminates a lot of the disproportionate benefit that exists.
Right.
Okay. Looking back, what do you think the best innovation is? I'm just so curious as a sociologist what you're going to say.
So what is the best innovation for singles? That's a really great question. And I would have to argue that it's the economic independence of women.
Yes.
Because marriage was thought of as like their avenue into middle class status. They had to get married. They had a husband that was working outside of the house that was able to provide for them. But now women had their own economic independence. They were able to participate in the labor force at higher rates. And then they had to really second guess whether or not they wanted to be married. It was thought of as a class. It catapults you into middle class status in some ways. But in some ways, women are like, hey, I'm doing okay by myself. I don't need to be married. I may want to be married, but I don't need to be married. There's a big difference between a want and a need, which gets back to the earlier conversation we were having, that people are like getting married because they think they need to get married, but they don't want to get married. So fast forward 15 years and now you're in COVID and you realize you don't like the person that you don't like the person that you're in a relationship with, and you would have been much happier as a single person, but you fell into these social pressures and are married, but you really did not need it, nor did you want it.
Yeah, I think that's a strong one in terms of the shift in perspective and the change in opportunity and so on. I mean, I think at one point, for a lot of history, if you were a woman and didn't want to live in your parents' house anymore,
right,
the only way to do that was to get married.
Right.
And so I like the idea that I'm pro optionality.
Yeah.
Right. I like that people can have options to be able to live their best lives.
Right. And those options should not be on a scale.
Yes. They
should not be on a scale. There's just different options. Not one option is more valued than the other option. They're just different options.
Indeed. Yeah. Yes. This comes up in, there's a book called Happy Singlehood.
Yes. Eliakim Kislev.
Yes, indeed. So I've been communicating with him as I've been preparing for the Selling to Singles, and to talk about the rise of solo living. He has these 8 reasons that we've seen this increase in the number of single people, not just in America, but worldwide. One of those critical ones is exactly your point, which is the shifting, for lack of a better word, sort of positive perspective and opportunities that women are having that's there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is, in terms of your other insights that you've had, what do you think, also stands out to you? Like, as you're writing this book, especially for the solo listener, in terms of giving them motivation, helping them understand a world, this particular world, especially because, as you're arguing, it's a model.
Right.
And was just said, it's a model for the white world.
But you have Chris Marsh in the background saying, what about race? What about race?
That's right.
What about race?
What you're suggesting is these folks are at the leading edge of a major shift in which they're actually making their lives better by forgoing the traditional, conventional route. Yeah.
Or they're choosing a different route.
Okay.
I don't want to say it's better, because then we start to put a value judgment on single versus married. I don't want to put a value judgment on either.
I wanted to say better in the sense that, middle class is better than poverty, right? Like,
well, that's a whole nother conversation, because if we look at like some of the outcomes, like physical health and mental health outcomes for people that are middle class, Black middle class in particular, they score like worse on all of these outcomes than do white middle class. So even though you've achieved middle class status, you're still Black in America, and you have to contend with that.
That's fair.
But if you're comparing, if you're comparing within,
that's right. Yeah, within. I think that.
But ignorance is bliss too. What you don't know, you don't know. It's like, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there is some. I mean, I think this is always a dangerous situation when you have. It depends on what your reference points are.
Right.
And so before we fired this up, we were talking a little bit about being young in America now in a world of social media.
Right.
And so when we were young without a world of social media, you sort of knew where you fell along some hierarchy in a school in terms of your coolness, your athletic ability, your academic ability, these various forms of status that exist within a high school or junior high. For example, like, I was very low on the cool. I was really modest on the athletic, and I was okay on the academic, so I could make my way, you know? But in today's world, you're never going to feel cool enough. You're never going to feel attractive enough. You're never going to feel as successful enough.
Right.
There's no 30 under 30 lists when we were 29.
Right.
Where you're just taking stock of, I haven't come that far, as grad students or whatever it might be. And so, but if you look, I mean, I can talk about myself. When I look at how I've done relative to where I started, I can be over the moon about it.
So I want to answer that in 3 different ways.
Please.
So first and foremost, I think if we think about like middle class versus people that are in poverty. In some ways, I do think that there is something to be said about living in a predominantly Black space and being around other people that have the same kind of like lived experiences as you. So you may not have to deal with those daily like microaggressions that me as a Black female professor in a predominantly white institution and among predominantly white faculty have to deal with. So that's a different kind of navigation that I have to navigate through versus being in the inner city where it's just all people that look like me. All of us are poor and we're all kind of like navigating this thing together. There's differences.
Right.
I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just simply saying there are differences.
They're both a struggle.
Just different kind of struggles.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So one was more of kind of like physiological struggle and one is more of like a psychological struggle. But at the end of the day, they're both going to lead to hypertension.
Okay.
Either way.
They're stressors.
Yes, we're going to get there. But the other point I want to make is that you were talking earlier about what are some of the other things that I've learned.
Yes.
And my book is not about Black women. There are about 5 single Black men that are out there. Okay. It was really important that I didn't write the book only about Black women. There are Black men that are out there as well, but women dominate the category.
Okay.
So when there are gender differences, I talk about those in the book, but it really is about just the Love Jones cohort, which includes both men and women.
Okay.
In that category.
So there's nothing special about being a woman in terms of these benefits. It's about being single.
Yes.
Okay.
And middle class.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But there are gender differences that do come up, and I talk about that.
Okay.
And one of the other things that towards the end of the book, in the conclusion, I tell people, I write it's almost like a love letter that I write to the Love Jones cohort. And I tell them, I'm like, listen, every time someone says to you, like, why aren't you married? Why don't you have any children? Ask them, what do you mean by that?
Oh.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, say it politely, like, hey, what do you mean by that? And at some point, they're going to realize the error in their thinking and keep pushing. And because what people automatically are going to say is, no, I don't really know. What do you mean by that?
Oh,
so
my
I
goodness.
I have 3 degrees, 3 houses, 3 cars, and 3 businesses. But the only thing you want to know is whether or not I'm married and have children. Like, what do you mean by that?
So, oh my goodness, I'm like furiously writing down right now because I'm prepping an episode on how to respond to anti-singles rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I want to do that because I don't think I'm that good at it.
Yeah.
My plan was to have a couple like comedic types and mostly come up with snarky, funny
Put the onus right back on. Nope. Put the onus right back on them. Be like, hey, what do you mean by that?
And so, this reminds me. So there's this like he's like a former FBI hostage negotiation guy. So he wrote a book that's super well known. He's just killing it. The book's called Never Split the Difference. Mm-hmm. And it's about using negotiation techniques in real life.
Okay.
And he has a saying, which is when someone makes an unreasonable demand in a negotiation, is to just say, how would I do that? Mm. How do I do that? Mm. Right? You push it back on the person, right. And it forces them to be more reasonable right. in their demands. Because if you say, how do they do that? And they can't, I want a 747 filled with this and this and that. You're just like, how do I do that? And the person goes, well, okay, I'll take a bus. Right. So,
right.
So I assume you have experience when someone says, Chris, you're so great. You're just so alive and fun and funny and successful. Why aren't you married?
Wait, so what do you mean by that?
Okay. So
it works every time. But again, their first response is probably going to be, no, I don't really know. Can you help explain to me? What do you mean by that?
And so then where do these conversations tend to go when you do this?
So one of two things will happen. Okay. They'll either be like, okay, well, let's have a conversation about this. Or they'll be like, oh, well, never mind.
They just moonwalk out of the scene.
Yeah, but you dropped a golden nugget and they're going to have to go home and think about that. They're like, wow, let me think about like my heteronormative understanding of like relationships and marriage and single and my views about singleness. Because if you're saying that, you're ultimately saying that there's some kind of, you're superimposing a deficit model on me. I have all these attributes, but I just don't have a spouse and I don't have children, so I'm not complete and whole. Like, come on.
Box.
Yeah.
Chris. I don't throw around the word genius often.
And you will not use it right now.
But that is genius.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
It's my pleasure.
I think like good people, listeners of Solo, if you take anything away from this, that's number one.
Right. And you can do it, but again, you can either do it in a very snarky kind of way, but what do you mean by that? Or you can be like, hey, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, help me understand.
Help me to understand.
Yes. I think you're right. I think the tone of that response matters because it's actually an act of compassion.
Right.
To do that because you give people a chance to, it's a teachable moment.
Right.
As we like to say when I was in student affairs, this is a teachable moment.
Right.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about golf.
Oh my gosh, let's talk about golf.
So I don't golf, and you do.
Yes.
And that violates lots of stereotypes.
Yes.
Yes. And my family.
And let's be clear. Peter's probably 6'5".
I'm 6'5".
Wow.
I'm a 6'5" white boy.
Right. And I'm a 5 foot black woman. And I'm golfing and you're not.
Yes. And my family.
Or 5 feet, 5 foot. I don't know which one's right.
I don't care.
Yeah, who cares?
Yeah.
You get the gist.
My family wanted me to golf.
Uh-huh.
So even though we were sort of in a difficult financial situation, my grandfather would help out sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I there's the two things that I would say I got exposed to that are kind of middle class, upper middle class as a child. One was I remember being young and doing horseback riding lessons.
Yes.
Which is not something that low-income kids tend to do.
Yes. Me and my sisters took horseback riding lessons.
And you do, really? Yeah. Yes. So I remember that. And then the other one was my grandfather paid for some golf lessons when I was in like middle school. And I even played on the freshman golf team and then gave it up and ended up, like doing other sports in high school and so on. And I have friends who golf. I'll occasionally go to a driving range with them and just hit some balls. And then the next day have, be incredibly sore because my body's not used to my wrist or elbow is sore, right? Kind of thing. Not used to doing it. But it just doesn't do it for me. And but for you, it's this delightful thing.
Yes.
But it's more than just that.
Yes.
Go on.
Yes,
Please
yes,
tell
yes.
me.
So I, when I started graduate school in 1999, I'm a swimmer. I've been a swimmer for years. We can have a whole long conversation about swimming because I just love to swim.
Okay.
So there was a guy who swam in the pool next to me, and he was a really good golfer, but I was a really good swimmer, and he wanted to learn how to golf. He wanted to learn how to swim, and I wanted to learn how to golf. So we bought some cheap clubs from Target for like $99, and I got 3 lessons, and I played twice.
Okay.
I took a 20-year hiatus and did not even pick up the sport.
Okay.
I was walking through the airport one day and saw this guy with a great smile, and he come to find out he was a golfer. I was like, well, I'm going to start being a golfer. And so I started golfing because he golfed, and we didn't work out, and his smile was like a farce, but that's a whole nother story.
But he gave you the gift of
he
golf.
Gave me the gift of golf. But I'm not, there's some people that like love the sport, and I don't love the sport.
Okay.
But there is a level of intellectual curiosity that exists on the golf course. Mm-hmm. So I volunteer at a golf course on Wednesdays. You got to understand the culture before you study the culture, right? And I hear the most sexist comments on the golf course. And I'm like, okay, here's a man that's old enough to be my grandfather. Mm-hmm. Do I check him for him talking about my legs or my behind? And I'm like, okay, so there are a lot of women that are golfers that join women's leagues.
Okay.
So they don't have to be harassed on the golf course.
Yes.
There's also this assumption where if you don't have the right paraphernalia, you probably are going to be assumed to not be a good golfer. So there's a class dynamic. So you got to buy the most expensive golf outfits and golf clubs. And if you don't, there's a hidden assumption. That's class. And then race. I've played at some of the best country clubs in the country, across the country. And when we come and we show up with our black faces, there's an assumption that we're going to slow up the pace of play, or the golf marshal's going to keep coming around. The course marshal is going to keep coming around to make sure.
Annoying.
So race still plays a huge role in golf. Class plays a huge role in golf, and gender plays a huge role in golf. So therefore, I'm writing myself a book about the racial, class, and gender dynamics in golfing.
So are you able to write off your golf, playing golf as a business expense?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, I have a wealth manager. I was like, oh yes, please understand. I have an asset manager. Yes, I absolutely can.
That is hilarious. And so your interest in this is personal because golf is a challenging sport and one that I've always thought of golf as like there is something special about it in the sense, especially if you live a busy, stressful life. It's sort of a relaxed, you're outside, fresh air, sun.
Vitamin D for free. But it's very analytical. It's an analytical sport. Because you have people that are going to try to like hit the ball with like brute force, and you're not going to get there. But if you think of it as a mind game, it's much easier to hit the ball. And so I actually hit relatively well. It's only been playing for a year.
That's cool. Well, I think the thing about it that's really fascinating as I hear you talk about this is, people talk about meritocracies. And so what they would say is, well, if you're a good golfer, you're going to be accepted. And the problem is there's all these things happening. First of all, it's very difficult to tell if anybody's a good golfer or not.
Like, right.
Right. So they use all these other cues.
Right.
Right. Like how good your clubs are and how good your outfit is and what club you're golfing at and so on and so forth.
There's all these social markers. Yeah.
Whether you're a male or a female, whether you're old or young, or whether you're all these kinds of things.
So it's so funny because when I started last year, I played last season. I started taking lessons June 4th last year.
Okay.
I took 6 more lessons. So I kind of know what I'm doing.
Sure.
But I wore the same outfit. I had one outfit because I kept saying it's not about my swag. It's about my swing.
Yes.
Because there is a class dynamic to it.
I hope you put that in your book.
I'm like, right? It's not about my swag. It's about my swing. This year, I have 2 outfits.
Okay.
Now, they are Lululemon. So, I spent a whole bunch of money on my Lululemon outfits, but I have 2 outfits. But I think that what happens is that if you don't have those social markers, you just kind of like are hesitant to even come and play golf because you think that you're not going to fit in.
Yes.
And golf is already excluded Black folks.
Yes.
And we're going to exclude poor folks. Now we're going to continue to exclude women. No.
I'm going to venture a guess. I feel like skiing has the same element to it. A premium on your sticks, on your skis, on your outfit, the mountain you're on.
Exactly.
And so on. Where I think like you're on the chairlift with someone and they're looking down at your skis and judging you and so on.
Golf is the exact same way.
I could see
and there's
that.
certain assumptions that are just inherent when you see certain people looking certain kind of ways, carrying certain kind of clubs and certain kind of outfits.
Yes, that's right. And obviously having certain skin colors.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about is this idea of singleism. And I'm eager to talk to a sociologist about this idea. So, so there's been emerging work on how single people are stereotyped and discriminated against. And, my sense of this is this is real. It's like well documented. It passes the sort of sniff test, face validity, but then also like good scholars have kind of looked at this. And I think the response to this often is, yes, but there are much bigger isms that we need to be tackling. Sexism, racism, heterosexism, sort of big 3, so to speak. And I want to get your reaction to that. As a sociologist, I've been working through some ideas, and I want to work through them with you, if I may, and get your professional and personal opinion on them. But I just want to hear your initial reaction to that statement. Yes, but it's not that bad compared to.
Right. So the way I have to answer this as a sociologist is that race is the master status.
Okay.
You're probably going to see my race and or my gender first. So race and gender are probably going to be the master statuses.
Okay.
But that's not to suggest that the other ones are not important.
Okay.
But for the most part, when I walk into the room, you're probably going to see a Black woman.
First versus the singleness.
Yeah, before you notice any of my class markers, before you notice any of my
sexuality, orientation, etc. I understand that.
And I'm not saying that those aren't important, but from what we know from the literature, it's like race and class. Race and gender are the 2 most master statuses that people typically see. Because they're the most obvious. Yeah.
Yes, I see that thing. So, okay, what any other reactions to this?
But I do believe that singleism is real.
Yes.
And we need to talk about it more. We don't talk about it enough. Because it almost becomes like the oppression Olympics, right?
Yes, that's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, we've got racism, we've got sexism. Now you want to throw singleism into it. I was like, but it exists.
Yes.
Right. I was like, we're all rushing to figure out who's more oppressed.
Okay, so can I workshop these ideas with you?
Absolutely. No, wait, hold on. Because one of the things I have to say is like, in the middle of COVID, things might change. So I might feel this way now. So a month from now, I might have a totally different perspective because things change in COVID.
Caveat noted.
Okay,
Caveat noted.
all right.
So the first idea has come up previously, and it's something that I learned back when I was in student affairs, which is we should fight singleism for the same reasons that we fight racism, sexism, and heterosexism, is that it's a form of oppression.
Okay.
Right? That it's holding people back. You know what I mean? It's wrong to do.
Right.
Right? We should be giving people equal opportunity.
Right.
That's there.
Okay.
That's the first idea.
Okay.
And so if you buy into one form of oppression, if you want to fight one form of oppression, you should want to fight all forms of oppression.
Right.
As a philosophical thing. MLK talked about this, I think also. That's the first idea.
Mm-hmm.
Second one is that singleism interacts with the master statuses.
Mm-hmm.
That is that women suffer more from singleism than men do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? You get the, Chris, you're so great. Why aren't you married?
Right.
More than Pete. First of all, people don't think I'm that great.
Well, I think you are.
But the people who do are less likely to say that to me than to you. So if you're interested in helping women, if you're interested in helping people of color, fighting singleism actually indirectly helps. Mm-hmm. That's the second idea.
Okay.
And then the third one is we should be celebrating singleness in the same way that we celebrate other forms of diversity, because diversity is good for our communities. It's good for the country. It's good for the world. Like the evidence, the value of diversity is so incredibly clear when it comes to innovation, when it comes to science, when it comes to nearly every positive thing that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. And because it is, single people have different needs, different perspectives, different wants and values. They bring something different to the table,
right.
so to speak.
Right.
And so it's worth it to try to find ways to help those people thrive.
Yes. Okay. So those are three really great ideas. The first one I would push back. I would emphatically push back against, because being Black in America, race, there's a cumulative disadvantage that exists in America along racial lines. It's been around for a long time, and it's how America was built.
Okay.
So if we put singlehood up there with racism and structural racism and the cumulative disadvantage, I think we're doing a disservice to the way in which America was built and the white supremacy that was built on.
Okay, but are you saying this because of this is is it a philosophical belief, or do you believe this is zero sum, that there's only so many units to fight oppression, and so we need to rank them and focus on the most important one?
How about the most egregious ones?
Okay.
So I think racism is the most egregious.
By the way, I don't disagree that it's most egregious.
Yeah.
But I'm okay.
Yes, I guess maybe we would have to possibly rank them. Oppression is bad regardless, but if you're ranking them, I think race is a much more salient conversation than single.
Yeah.
And like we said earlier, like when I walk in the room, you see my race, you see gender,
yes.
right? So we know about the wage gap. We know that there's a gender wage gap in America where women make 80 cents on the dollar that every man makes. Mm-hmm. That's structural. That's not going anywhere. That's been around for quite a while. Singleness and singleism is kind of a newer concept that's showing up. But that wage gap has been around for a while. Mm-hmm. I was like, structural racism. I was like, Diva Pager, she was a sociologist. She did this really great study, and she found that Black men with a college degree were less likely to get a call back for a job interview than a white man with a criminal record.
Oh yeah, these things are crazy.
Yeah,
these resume studies and so on are appalling.
Right.
Where they take the same resume, they change the name, and you get wildly different behavior.
Right. And that's been around for a while. So those kind of things have been around. The singleism is a newer kind of concept. And you don't necessarily know my single status when I walk into the room. But I can't take off my race. I can't take that off.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
But then the last one I thought was really interesting too. What was the last one?
That singleism is a form, being single is a form of diversity.
Yeah.
And that because we value diversity, we ought to value diversity. We should try to uplift people who are.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that.
So I should lead with that one.
Yes, I like that. I like that one. I do like that one.
I think it's fair. I'm just working through these ideas. Chris.
Peter.
Dr. Chris Marsh. I am over the moon talking to you about this stuff. It is so fascinating and I think really important. You're doing really important work.
Yes.
I want to wish you well on the book. I look forward to getting it.
Yes.
When it comes out. Is there any sort of parting thought as you're kind of processing the stuff that we've been talking about that I've overlooked that you think's important for this particular audience? Not to put too much pressure on you, but you are a professor. You're used to talking about things
right
off the cuff.
No, I don't think there's any parting thoughts that I want to give.
Thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.